Today, Thursday, December 14, the leaders of 27 member countries are gathering in Brussels to meet and discuss the bloc's enlargement strategy, Ukraine, the war in the Middle East, the budget, and security and defense. Hello and welcome to EURACTIV's Beyond the Byline podcast. I am Evi, and in this episode, we explore the hot topics on the agenda of the last European Council Summit for 2023. The end-of-year discussions hold symbolic importance for both the EU and Ukraine, so what can we expect to be discussed in this EUCO on this matter?
Despite the geopolitical turbulence in various areas of the world, maybe Middle East in specific, I think Ukraine remains very high on the EU's agenda.
Andriy Korniychuk is policy analyst at the Foundation for European Progressive Studies.
And I think these discussions at the end of the year are very important symbolically for both parties, EU, its member states, and Ukraine as well. I think looking from the Ukraine's perspective, the developments on the battlefield, the counteroffensive, the ambitions perhaps that were set, maybe miscalculated at the beginning of the year, were not as high as expected. At the same time, we also know that in terms of the EU-Ukraine relations, the certain promises, as maybe like the ammunition delivery, that also did not reach that expectation. So I think continuing with the accession can be still that success story. That's something very tangible for both sides, and certainly it's an existential necessity for both. Because I think EU is quite on board with the concept that Ukraine is part of the new peace and security, that Ukraine is part of the new security and peace architecture. And obviously for Ukraine, the accession is an existential necessity to maintain its war effort, but also think about its rebuild.
Already from mid-December, meetings have taken place regarding Ukraine aid, currently blocked by Viktor Orban's government, who mentioned while arriving at the summit that Ukraine hasn't met at least 3 preconditions out of 7.
We set up 7 preconditions, and in the evaluation of the Commission, 3 out of the 7 is not fulfilled. So therefore, there is no reason to discuss anything, because preconditions were not met. So we have to come back later on, revert to that issue again when it is fulfilled by the Ukrainians. Why we are here is not to make business. It's not about bargain. It's not about deal. We represent approaches and principles. So to give money to Ukraine is easy to do because in short term the money for Ukraine is already in the budget. So there is no any extra decision to give it in short term. In long term and the bigger sum of money, my position is that we should give it outside. But we are not under the pressure of the time because the bridging solution is already in the budget.
So is there hope for a diplomatic breakthrough despite the challenges?
As we see from what Charles Michel was also doing, coming shorter from his China trip. So China is obviously also a major geopolitical actor. Sort of that step, the gesture that he came earlier to go to Viktor Orban to have that discussion in Ukraine points exactly to what you have mentioned, meaning that there's still certain disagreements on how it's to proceed with the opening the accession talks, but also with the Ukraine facility, which should be around 50 billion euros of Ukraine support. Obviously, we also know that Viktor Orban, he sitting at this negotiation table, he has his national interests at stake. So indeed, it seems that up until the very last hours prior to the actual meeting on this high level, we will be still having these dinners and these discussions, this ongoing work to have an agreement among all the member states, actually to proceed to open the accession talks, to give Ukraine the necessary supports and needs. But unfortunately for Ukraine, this is indeed a very diplomatically heavy process, which involves a lot of bargaining chips to be put on the table. And the hope is that these talks indeed would be opened. But we have to see up until the end. Maybe we should, ironically, you mentioned President Macron. I mean, he indeed will sit with Viktor Orban, but at the same time, his track record of doing these kind of high-level negotiations is not too optimistic. but let's hope that he can sort of shift the tide of destiny in his favor in this case and deliver when it comes also to bringing Orban on board with all the other member states and governments.
The EU is intensifying its efforts to adapt and address loopholes, particularly in response to recent developments such as the situation with Ukrainian children and elections in occupied territories. The EU is also exploring the possibility of another package of sanctions against Russia.
I think it's a matter of time when the next package of sanctions will be introduced. But as very often it comes with the EU, it's all the devil is in the details. So it depends on what kind of agreements will be reached. Certainly, we see that through additional packages of sanctions, the EU tries to tighten up the grip on Russia. So far, overall, the sanctions have brought certain leverage into leveraging sort of geopolitically, economically restraining Russia, but certainly it didn't bring the result that everyone expected at the very beginning of the full-scale invasion. So indeed, the EU looks all the time at the loopholes and tries to address them. It certainly, in this new package, it would like to address, so adapt and be flexible enough, address the recent developments. For instance, it wants to target individuals who are responsible for handling the situation with the Ukrainian children that are basically being kidnapped and then end up in Russia. They want to target individuals who are involved actually in the so-called elections in the occupied territories. So indeed, the EU tries to find ways to adapt. So I think it's a matter of time when we arrive. Actually, the new package is already proposed. So it's a matter of time when the agreement is reached. The difficulty, as we see now, also within these discussions, is again on the very essence of these sanctions and sort of different details, which for different member states, there are different angles, different national interests, different perspectives. So let's see how it goes. But I would expect that we see soon the 12th package of EU sanctions.
The ongoing discussions on enlargement highlight a growing consensus on the need for a balanced approach between the South and East. The EU emphasizes that the accession process is a merit-based and cooperative one, with no country eligible for shortcuts.
I think the accession talks is a substantial part of the current support and sort of the nature, the essence of the relations between the EU and Ukraine. So in this sense, as mentioned at the very beginning of our discussion today, I think that the most important decision that everyone awaits is the symbolic but also very practical step of opening the accession talks with Ukraine. Because certainly for Ukraine, that will be the fulfillment of the work it has done and one of the clear goals, aims of its current defense war against Russia, so to continue on its path of European aspiration. And we see that actually since the beginning of the full-scale invasion, indeed, the progress can be measured, can be sort of, it's very tangible from the perspective both of the European institutions, member states, EU as a whole, but also Ukraine. The proposed enlargement package is certainly very ambitious by the Commission, in which the Commission obviously also recommends opening the EU accession talks with Ukraine, is a very ambitious geopolitical gesture, one can also say. So in that sense, I think we indeed should expect that progress, and in the interest of Ukraine is to open them as soon as possible. Ukraine needs the European technocratic machine working in its favor. So as the sooner it gets its foot into the door and gets the bureaucracy working, the better for Ukraine. So I'm quite sure that again. We should expect progress on actually opening the accession talks, but I think then we move into the nitty-gritty process of actual reform, which can take obviously years. And I think including Viktor Orban, very much understands these processes. So the sheer fact of opening the accession talks doesn't mean that they will end in 5 years. So I think from a symbolic point of view, to sum up, we should expect the gesture of opening the accession talks very relatively soon, and then the real work would start, and where Ukraine also needs to show a lot of progress in terms of reform, a merit-based approach.
And what can the other candidate countries expect from these talks?
There is an increasing understanding that there needs to be a balanced approach in terms of Eastern and the Southern enlargement, although you can also read from certain experts that maybe even with the enlargement package, there's a certain refocus towards the east of the EU. Maybe I wouldn't go as far as that, but because I think from the real work that is ongoing into molding and framing how the reform of the EU should be undergoing, including its enlargement policy, how it should aid its peace and security architecture, there is an understanding that it needs more balance between the south and east of its borders. So in that sense, I also think that from the Ukraine side, including its civil society, the very clear message that we do not expect any preferential treatment. We do not expect any fast-track solutions that will bypass this merit-based approach. We are ready to deliver on actual reforms, and then please assess us. But I think that what we learned from last decades, all of the sides, all the potential candidates, whether it's in the Western Balkans or Ukraine or now Moldova, or potentially maybe Georgia, they would certainly be looking into the political decision, because ultimately, even if all potential candidates deliver on the reforms, it all ends up as a political decision of the member states. So I think in this case, EU has some homework to do as well. But coming back and summing up your question, I think the understanding is very clear that if EU is to succeed with its enlargement policy, if it's to build a more credible, partner-driven, equal relations with its potential candidates and partners, it needs a balanced approach which does not drive geopolitical rivalry, but rather drives cooperation and understanding that we are in this whole process together.
But expecting quick progress from Ukraine wouldn't be reasonable, according to Andriy.
What we should remember when we look at the current developments on the battlefield of Ukraine is that we should not simply maybe expect quick and rapid developments from day to day. Unfortunately, for all the parties involved in supporting of Ukraine, we are currently in the world of attrition. And with the war of attrition, there needs to be resilience, understanding that it can go on for many more months. I think that understanding is growing. Certainly, the resilience of Ukraine is being praised, but we have to remember also that this resilience of Ukraine, it does not come out of nothing. And for this resilience to keep going, Ukraine needs support. And that support is both economic, humanitarian, military, but also moral and symbolic. So I think with how EU and its member states approach different steps, even if it's like symbolic decisions of granting certain opening accession talks, etc., their value and contribution for the battlefield sort of dynamics is also very high. So it's a very complex picture, but we, I think, should realize that even smaller symbolic steps also have a very important contribution to Ukraine's victory on the battlefield.
The budget is one of the hot topics on the agenda as well, but what can EU leaders focus on?
There are two sets of expectations, in a sense. From one side, we have the expectation of what will really be on the table. That is a package deal on the budget that has two main components. One is the Ukraine facility, and the other one is the package deal for the Strategic Technology for Europe platform, the so-called STEP. So they will be discussing these two items that will be somehow tough, but I'm quite confident they will arrive to an agreement.
David Rinaldi is Director of Studies and Policy at the Foundation for European Progressive Studies.
Be discussing what are the expectations the Europeans should have on our leaders. Because the discussion on the economic part, particularly in a moment in which the ECFIN is also struggling to find an agreement on the fiscal rules, should probably point in the direction of expanding somehow the leaders' interest into spending for competitiveness and for the EU Green Deal, rather than finding a very narrow agreement on little new money for strategic technologies.
The latest EU budget negotiation box drafted by the Spanish EU Council presidency, shared with EU ambassadors on December 6, shows commitment from member states to limit the EU's budget increase to a minimum while safeguarding financial aid to Ukraine. What is the latest compromise proposal on the EU 7-year budget review, and why has it faced resistance from member states? Can we expect a common stance on this after the Council?
Unfortunately, the common stance from the side of member states, from almost everywhere in Europe, is that nobody has the appetite to put more money in the basket of EU budget and money. I think it plays an important role also the ruling of the German Constitutional Court that was used immediately from the Minister of Finance to say, hey, you see, we have no more money to put into the European budget. Plus, the appetite from certain Eastern European countries to somehow chip in additional money for Ukraine is not very high. So in general, there is this feeling that the final deal might actually reduce the initial proposal of the Commission of about 25%, with somehow very little new budget, new money, despite the extremely big needs. And if I can comment maybe on the policy that will be is likely to be applied with a bit of sarcasm, the approach is more likely the one of scraping the barrel, in the sense that compared to the initial Commission proposal, we are going to have much less new budget, new resources, and instead we are going to find even more ways to already use the budget that has been somehow committed.
The prevailing sentiment among European member states, fueled by fiscal constraints and the German Constitutional Court ruling, suggests reluctance to allocate additional funds to the EU budget. This discussion anticipates a potential reduction of around 25% from the Commission's initial proposal, highlighting challenges in securing substantial new resources despite pressing needs.
One of the things that will be certainly done from my viewpoint is this ability to do more with less. So there will be again the focus on not only the new money, but they will try to focus the attention, particularly of the media, and they will focus the communication on the amount of money that can be leveraged by the European public intervention, with a lot of the money that will be spent on strategic technologies that is meant to leverage private fund as well. But in the end, the creativity will not only be on the spending or how to multiply the European budget, will also be on where to find the resources. So in this scraping the barrel approach, they will certainly end up using all the savings from interest repayments in the RRF, unused loans from the RRF, money from the cohesion funds, and quite certainly also frozen assets from Russian oligarchs, maybe even overestimating the amounts that will be in the end available.
The forthcoming strategy appears to prioritize achieving more with fewer resources, emphasizing the leveraging of funds through strategic technologies and public intervention. But how can member countries come up with better planning, not only in spending, but also in sourcing funds?
The situation is definitely not easy, and I think in this case there will be still a compromise for sure, but I don't see and I don't expect somehow the European Union and EUCO to backtrack substantially from the promised somehow spending on the Ukraine facility. I think that the connection will not be too much the tension between the STEP and the Ukraine facility, but it will be a little bit more between the political agreement on the accession path of Ukraine and instead the money to Ukraine. And in this regard, I see, of course, the Orban somehow requests more tougher on the path to accession, where I see other member states somehow conceding a little bit more in exchange for at least a quite sizable package for the Ukraine facility. So maybe lower than what the Commission proposed, or maybe the same amount, but more loans than grants. But I see somehow the support to Ukraine some more easy to be agreed on for the financial side than on the political accession.
The coming year of 2024 is also the year of the European elections. In what ways can we expect the elections to influence the bloc's budget?
It will definitely be impacted by the elections, by the campaign. In one way or another, this will be somehow a demarcation line between political families. And I hope that, in a sense, many families that are campaigning on the EU Green Deal, delivering on the digital or the green transition, being able to deliver on expectation from the citizens in terms of security, then they will have to realize that in order to do these things, the European Union will need a budget, will need a proper budget, also in a context in which China, the United States, and other countries are not waiting. And we definitely need our industry to be at the level of securing, employment and prosperity for the entire continent. So it is the budget is really a priority because we need to secure a strong union. And in this context, one of the big things that will somehow need to be expected is also a transformation of the governance, probably, of the budget, in which the lesson learned from the RRF, the milestones and targets, will need, in a way, to be included in more thoroughly into the EU budget. This is quite certainly one of the big political deals and transformation of the EU budget we'll need to see in 2024, when the discussion on the next EU budget will kick off.
And there is a significant worry about European leaders abandoning the idea of responding to economic challenges similar to the US Inflation Reduction Act, which, despite a small proposal by the Commission, it's facing further reduction.
One important thing is the fact that European leaders have abandoned this idea of the sovereignty fund. So when the US came up with the Inflation Reduction Act, and there was this feeling that Europe should respond with a similar climate and fiscal stimulus. But in the end, the entire project derailed. What we had is this little step that the Commission proposed. Now in the next EUCO at the end of the year, this will be further reduced. And I think that in 2024, I hope that we are going to find one European leader in Europe that will somehow table back this issue of industrial policy, green industrial policy, seriously, because we really have problems in securing European capacity.
Thank you very much. I am Evi Kiori, and this was EURACTIV's Beyond the Byline podcast. Visit EURACTIV to stay on top of the latest news, sign up to our podcast newsletter, and if you haven't subscribed to the podcast, you can do so on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, or wherever it is that you listen to your podcast. Thank you for tuning in, and until next time. As part of our commitment to accuracy, inclusion, and transparency, EURACTIV is part of the Trust Project.